In November of 1780, in the trackless bogs of Clarendon County, South Carolina, a 26-year-old British officer named Banastre Tarleton pushed his horses past the point of collapse. He had been chasing a man for 7 hours through marsh and gorge. Through wetlands, no cavalry was meant to enter. His dragoons were the most feared mounted force in North America. They had ridden down armies. They had butchered men under flags of surrender. They had earned a name that made entire towns surrender at the sound of approaching hooves. And on that day, in those bogs, they failed. The man they were chasing slipped into Ox Swamp and disappeared. Tarleton reined up, watched his exhausted mount steam in the cold air, and called the man a damned old fox. The name stuck. Francis Marion would be remembered as the Swamp Fox for the rest of American history. And Banastre Tarleton would ride back to his camp and burn the farms of every patriot family within reach, because that is what a humiliated officer does when geography defeats him. 2 months later, on a frozen morning in January of 1781, Tarleton would meet another American commander on what looked like an open pasture. No bogs, no swamps, no wetlands. Just dry winter grass on a gentle ridge, 6 miles south of a flooded river. He would look at the field and see exactly the kind of ground his cavalry was built for. He would order his men forward at a trot, and he would discover, too late, that the swamps had come for him a second time. That this time, they had hidden themselves under the grass. By the end of this video, you will understand how a young black dragoon, possibly named Collins, saved the American Revolution in 3 seconds of close-quarters combat. You will understand why a 50-foot deep layer of biotite gneiss buried beneath the Carolina soil decided the fate of an empire. You will understand the geological accident that turned an open pasture into a death trap. You will understand how an American general with a permanently scarred back, who could barely walk for the pain in his joints, designed a defense so precise that modern military academies still teach it. And you will understand the moment, lasting less than an hour, that began the chain of events ending 9 months later in the surrender of a British army at Yorktown. These battles were not won by numbers. They were won by ground, by the men who understood it and the men who did not. Hit that subscribe button. Let us step into Cowpens. To understand why Cowpens happened, we have to understand the war it grew out of. Not the war of muskets and bayonets that history books usually describe. The other war, the Civil War, the one fought in the backcountry of the Carolinas, neighbor against neighbor, where the Continental Army was often a distant rumor and the real battles happened in barnyards, on country roads, in the dark. By the autumn of 1780, the Southern theater of the American Revolution had collapsed into something close to chaos. The Continental Army had suffered 2 of the worst defeats in its history. At Charleston in May, an entire American garrison surrendered to British forces, the largest single American capitulation of the war. At Camden in August, the Southern Army under Horatio Gates was shattered in less than an hour, militiamen fleeing the field at the first British bayonet charge. The British commander in the South, Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, looked at the wreckage of Patriot resistance and saw an opportunity to subdue the entire region. His strategy was straightforward. Establish a chain of fortified outposts across the Carolina backcountry. Use those outposts as bases for mobile columns that could ride out, crush local resistance, and ride back. Pacify the population through a combination of military pressure and political accommodation, recruiting loyalist militia to do the daily work of suppression. Then, once the South was secure, turn north and finish the war. It did not work the way he expected. The backcountry was not the low country. The wealthy plantations of the coast, where patriot elites supported the revolution and where British forces could win allies by freeing enslaved laborers and disrupting patriot agricultural wealth, gave way as you moved inland to a different world. The backcountry was settled by Scots-Irish farmers, German immigrants, mixed populations of people who had come to America with their own grievances against the British Crown, or with no particular politics at all. Many of them had remained loyal to King George. Many of them had not. Most of them simply wanted to be left alone. The British made that impossible. Officers in the backcountry, frustrated by the slow pace of pacification and the constant pinpricks of patriot raiders, turned to intimidation. They burned farms. They threatened families. They allowed their loyalist auxiliaries to settle old scores under the cover of military operations. Every burned barn produced a new patriot recruit. Every threatened family produced a new informant for the rebel cause. The British had walked into a war they did not understand, and the harder they tried to win it through force, the deeper they sank. Into this situation, in December of 1780, came a new American commander. Nathaniel Greene had been sent south by George Washington to take over what was left of the Southern Army. He arrived at Charlotte, North Carolina, on December 2nd, 1780, and found a force of roughly 2,300 men on paper, of whom only about 1,500 were present and fit for duty, and barely 800 were properly equipped to fight. Many of them huddled near campfires, practically naked. He had no money. He had limited ammunition. He had militias whose enlistments would expire in weeks. And he was facing a British army that outnumbered him, outgunned him, and held every strategic position of value in the southern colonies. Greene did something that, by every conventional standard of military doctrine, looked insane. He divided his army. He sent Brigadier General Daniel Morgan west of the Catawba River with about 600 men. Morgan's orders were to forage for supplies, protect Patriot civilians from Loyalist raids, and threaten the British strongholds in the western backcountry, particularly the fortified post at 96. Greene kept the remaining force to the east, where he could threaten Cornwallis's main army. The conventional wisdom said you never divided an inferior force in the face of a superior enemy. The conventional wisdom said Cornwallis would simply pick one wing of the divided army and destroy it before the other could come to its aid. Greene knew the conventional wisdom. He had read the same military manuals as every other officer of his generation. He divided his army anyway. His reasoning was subtle. By splitting his force, Greene forced Cornwallis to make a choice. If Cornwallis concentrated his army to attack one of Greene's wings, the other wing would be free to ravage British outposts and rouse the countryside. If Cornwallis tried to attack both wings simultaneously, he would have to divide his own force, surrendering the numerical superiority that was his greatest advantage. Either way, Greene gained time. Time to recruit. Time to train, time to wait for circumstances to shift. Cornwallis took the bait. He divided his army. He kept his main force at Winnsboro, South Carolina, to watch Greene. He detached the most aggressive officer in his command, the man who had built a reputation on speed and ruthlessness, to ride west and destroy Daniel Morgan. That officer was Banastre Tarleton. To understand what happened at Cowpens, you have to understand the two men who fought there. Not just their commands, not just their tactics, the men themselves. Because Cowpens was not just a battle. It was the collision of two opposite philosophies of war, embodied in two opposite human beings, and the outcome was shaped by who they were as much as by what they did. Banastre Tarleton was 26 years old in January of 1781. He had been born into a prosperous Liverpool merchant family, the son of a man who had been mayor of the city and whose fortune came from the sugar and slave trades. He had attended Oxford and studied law at the Middle Temple. When his father died in 1773, Tarleton inherited £5,000 and gambled most of it away in a single year. To save him from ruin, his mother helped him purchase a cornet's commission in the 1st Dragoon Guards in April of 1775. He had arrived in America later that year as a young cavalry officer. By 1780, 4 years later, he commanded one of the most feared military formations in North America. His command was the British Legion. It was not a standard British regiment. It was a provincial unit, raised in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, composed of American loyalists who had thrown in their lot with the Crown. Light infantry, dragoons, and a small artillery component, all organized for speed. The Legion wore green coats rather than the standard British red, a distinction that, on the battlefields of the South, would become its own kind of warning. When a green-coated horseman appeared on the horizon, the men who saw him knew what was coming. Tarleton's doctrine was simple: speed and shock. Find the enemy, charge before they could form, ride them down, pursue without mercy until the enemy ceased to exist as a fighting force. He had used this doctrine successfully at Monk's Corner in April of 1780, at Lanud's Ferry in May, at Camden in August. Each victory had built his reputation. Each victory had made his next enemy more likely to break before contact, simply because Tarleton was the one riding toward them. But the reputation had its real origin in a single afternoon in May of 1780, on a road outside a place called the Waxhaws. Colonel Abraham Buford, commanding a force of Virginia Continentals, was retreating north after the fall of Charleston. Tarleton, with a smaller but faster column, ran him down on the afternoon of May 29th. What happened next would become the subject of dispute for 2 centuries. The American account, supported by survivor testimony, claimed that Buford raised a white flag of surrender and that Tarleton's dragoons ignored it, riding through the surrendering Virginians and cutting them down. The British account, including Tarleton's own, claimed that during the parley a shot was fired that killed Tarleton's horse, and that his men, believing their commander dead, fell into a fit of revenge that he could not control. The numbers were not in dispute. 113 patriots killed, 150 severely wounded, many of them left on the field to die, a handful of prisoners taken. It was less a battle than a massacre, and the name Waxhaws would carry weight in the Southern campaigns from that day forward. It gave rise to a phrase: Tarleton's quarter. It meant no quarter. It meant a surrender that would not be honored. And it became, more than any pamphlet or recruiting speech, the single most effective recruiting tool the Patriot cause possessed in the Southern colonies. Every man who heard the phrase Tarleton's quarter knew what waited for him if he laid down his arms. Better to fight, better to die fighting than to die surrendering. By January of 1781, Banastre Tarleton was the man Patriot mothers used to frighten their children. He was the embodiment, in person, of everything the Continental Army hated about the British war effort. He was 26 years old, gentry-born, his commission purchased, his career built on speed and on a reputation for cruelty that he had earned and never disavowed. The man chosen to face him could not have been more different. Daniel Morgan was 44 years old in January of 1781. He had been born in New Jersey to Welsh immigrant parents in July of 1736. He had left home as a teenager after a fight with his father and made his way south to the Virginia frontier, where he worked as a wagoner, hauling supplies across the Appalachians. His men called him the Old Wagoner for the rest of his life. He had grown into a man of enormous physical strength, 6 feet tall in an era when most men were several inches shorter, and a reputation for brawling that followed him from camp to camp. In 1755, during the French and Indian War, Morgan was working as a civilian teamster for General Edward Braddock's army when an argument with a British officer turned violent. The officer struck Morgan first, hitting him with the flat of his sword. Morgan responded by knocking the man to the ground with a single punch. For striking an officer of the king, regardless of provocation, he was sentenced to 500 lashes. 500 lashes was, in the typical case, a death sentence. The shock of the punishment alone killed many men before the count was complete. Those who survived the punishment often died of infection in the weeks that followed. Morgan was tied to a post, and the drummer began to count, and Morgan counted along with him. He counted out loud, every blow, watching the drummer with eyes that the British soldiers present would remember for the rest of their lives. He survived. His back was permanently scarred. He claimed for the rest of his life that the British had miscounted, that they had only delivered 499 lashes, that the King of England therefore owed him one. He told this story often. He told it with a grin. He told it to remind his men and himself that there was nothing the British could do to him that they had not already tried. He fought through the French and Indian War. He fought through the early campaigns of the Revolution. He led riflemen at the disastrous American invasion of Quebec in 1775, where he was captured and held prisoner for nearly a year. He led riflemen at Saratoga in 1777, where his marksmen helped decide the most important American victory of the war's first half. By the time he came south in 1780, he was a brigadier general, and he was a man in serious physical decline. He suffered from sciatica that made riding agony. He suffered from arthritis that swelled his joints. His back, scarred from those lashes a quarter century earlier, ached in cold weather. He was overweight. He was tired. He was, by his own admission to friends, beginning to wonder whether he had one more campaign left in him, and he was about to fight the most important battle of his life against an opponent half his age. But Morgan had something Tarleton did not. He had an intimate understanding of the men under his command, because he was one of them. He had hauled wagons. He had been flogged. He had spent his nights around campfires with frontier riflemen and Virginia militiamen and Maryland Continentals. And he knew, in a way that an Oxford-educated cavalry officer could never know, what made these men fight and what made them run. On the night before Cowpens, Morgan moved among the campfires of his army. He could barely walk. His joints screamed at every step. But he moved from fire to fire, talking to the men, explaining his plan, telling jokes, telling the story of his 500 lashes. He told the militiamen, the men who had broken and fled at Camden 5 months earlier, that he was not asking them to win the battle. He was asking them to fire 2 volleys, just 2. Then they could retreat with honor. He told them where to stand. He told them where to fall back to. He told them, looking each one in the eye, that he believed they could do it. In the morning, they did. But to get to that morning, we have to follow the pursuit that brought both men to the place where the battle would be fought. And the pursuit, like everything else about the Southern campaign, was shaped by water. The major river systems of the Carolinas all flow in roughly the same direction. They originate in the Blue Ridge Mountains to the northwest, and they flow toward the southeast, draining the Piedmont into the coastal plain. The Santee, the Pee, the Savannah, and between them, a web of tributaries, the Inori, the Tiger, the Pacolet, the Broad, the Catawba, the Yadkin, that turn the backcountry into a network of waterways that any army moving across the region must cross and cross again. In the winter of 1780 and 1781, those waterways were swollen. Heavy seasonal rains had turned every creek into a torrent. Fords that were usable in summer were impassable in winter. Bridges that existed were few, and most of them had been destroyed by one side or the other to slow enemy movement. To move an army across the Carolina backcountry in January meant to fight the rivers as much as the enemy. Tarleton moved fast. That was his doctrine, his identity, the thing that defined him. When Cornwallis gave him orders to find and destroy Morgan, Tarleton drove his men forward at a punishing pace. Through rain, through mud, through cold that would have stopped a less driven commander. He built makeshift boats to cross the Enoree. He found fords to cross the Tiger. He pushed through the Paxolay country with his legions strung out behind him, foragers ranging ahead, scouts pressing forward to find the trail of the American force he was hunting. Morgan, on the other hand, was moving north, away from Tarleton, but slowly. His men were tired. His supplies were running thin. He had militia attached to his command, and militia, as every Continental officer knew, was unpredictable. They were brave one day and gone the next. They fought magnificently, or they ran without firing. Their enlistments expired at inconvenient moments. They demanded to go home when their crops needed planting. To command militia was to command an army that might, at any moment, simply cease to exist. Morgan crossed the Paxolay River. He pushed north toward the Broad River. And on January 16, 1781, he reached a place 6 miles south of the Broad called Hannah's Cowpens. The place was named for a man named Hannah, who had once grazed cattle there. It was a pasture, a clearing in the woods, a wintering ground for herds, with a road running through it called the Green River Road, leading from the Paxolay country up toward the fords of the Broad. It was not a fortress. It was not a defensive position in any conventional sense. There were no walls. There were no heights commanding the approaches. It was, by every standard of 18th century military doctrine, exactly the kind of ground a defender should avoid. Morgan looked at it and decided to fight there. His reasoning, when he explained it later to a skeptical Nathaniel Greene, was characteristic. The Broad River, 6 miles to his rear, was flooded. If he tried to cross it under pressure from Tarleton's cavalry, his rear guard would be caught on the banks and destroyed. If he kept retreating, his militia would eventually melt away, and they would do so faster the further north he went, because the South Carolina and Georgia militiamen in his command were legally obligated only to defend their home states. Cross into North Carolina, and they would desert in droves. Morgan needed to fight, and he needed to fight where his militia could not run. The flooded Broad behind him would serve that purpose. There would be no retreat. The choice would be victory or annihilation. And Morgan, who had survived 500 lashes and a Quebec winter prison and the long retreat from Canada, was a man who understood how to use the absence of options as a weapon. But he needed more than just a position with no retreat. He needed ground. And what he saw at Hannah's Cowpens, when he walked the field on the afternoon of January 16th, was ground that almost no one else would have recognized for what it was. The geology of Hannah's Cowpens does not appear in most accounts of the battle. It should. It decided everything. The Carolina Piedmont, where Cowpens sits, is built on what geologists call the inner Piedmont terrain. It is a stack of metamorphic rock thrust sheets, ancient formations pushed northwestward over each other hundreds of millions of years ago during the building of the Appalachian Mountains. Cowpens specifically lies within the 6-mile thrust sheet, a layer composed of biotite gneiss, amphibolite gneiss, mica schist, and metagranite. To anyone but a geologist, these are just names. To a soldier who understands ground, they are a code that describes how water behaves on a battlefield, how horses move on a battlefield, how artillery can or cannot be deployed. The ridge at Cowpens, the gentle rise that runs through the center of the battlefield, is capped by a particular kind of rock called weathered quartz muscovite schist. It is permeable. Water that falls on it drains quickly downward, leaving the surface dry and firm. The ridge itself is the eroded hinge of a series of tightly folded geological structures that include the nearby landmark of Thickety Mountain. Standing on the ridge in winter, a man would find the ground beneath his boots solid, dry, capable of supporting cavalry charges and infantry formations, and the recoil of artillery pieces. On either side of the ridge, the geology changes. The flanks of the ridge are underlain by a different rock. Strongly foliated biotite gneiss, impermeable. Water that falls on it does not drain. It collects, it pools, it saturates the soil above the gneiss until that soil becomes something a soldier would call a bog. These flanking depressions, the low ground on either side of the central ridge, are called swales. In summer, in dry weather, the swales are merely soft ground. A horseman could cross them with care. An infantryman could march through them at a reduced pace. In winter, in wet weather, after months of seasonal rains, the swales transform. The phenomenon is called wet weather springs. Water that has been collecting for months in the impermeable gneiss begins to emerge at the surface, seeping up through the soil, turning the swales into shallow marshes. The footing becomes uncertain. Horses sink. Artillery wheels lock in the mud. Infantry formations, which depend on the ability to move in coordinated lines, lose their alignment as men stumble through the soft ground at different rates. A formation that enters a wet weather swale comes out the other side disorganized, exhausted, and behind schedule. This was the ground Morgan saw on January 16, 1781. He saw a dry ridge running between two wet swales. He saw a road, the Green River Road, that ran directly along the spine of the ridge, the only route across the field that did not pass through the saturated flanking ground. He saw, in other words, a natural bottleneck. An attacker coming up the Green River Road would find himself unable to deploy laterally without entering the swales. He would be forced to advance straight up the ridge, into whatever defense was waiting for him. With his cavalry's mobility advantage neutralized by the marshy ground on either flank, Morgan did not have a geologist with him. He did not need one. He had something better. He had spent his entire life as a wagoner, a frontier rifleman, a backwoods soldier. He had spent decades reading ground for a living. He saw the dry ridge and he saw the wet swales, and he understood, instinctively, that the field was offering him something rare. It was offering him a battlefield that would make Tarleton's numerical advantages disappear. He chose his lines. He placed his men, and he waited. The deployment Morgan designed for Cowpens is one of the most studied tactical arrangements in American military history. It is taught at West Point. It is analyzed in war colleges around the world. It has been called the only true double envelopment in the history of the American Revolution. And what makes it so remarkable is not just the geometry of it, but the psychology embedded inside that geometry. Morgan put his men in 3 successive lines, all of them straddling the Green River Road, all of them on the dry ridge, all of them within sight of each other. The first line, furthest forward, was composed of about 150 skirmishers, elite riflemen from Georgia and the North Carolina backcountry, men who had been hunting with long rifles since they could lift one, men who could pick a squirrel out of an oak tree at 100 yards. Their orders were specific. They were not to stand against the British charge. They were to take cover behind trees, fire deliberate, aimed shots, and target the officers. Aim for the epaulets, Morgan told them. Bring down the men in the gold braid, then fall back, in their own time, to the second line. The second line, 150 yards behind the skirmishers, was composed of about 300 militiamen under Colonel Andrew Pickens. Pickens was a Presbyterian elder, a stern and quiet man who had been on parole to the British until a loyalist raid on his home convinced him to break his parole and rejoin the war. His militia were the men Morgan was most worried about. They were the men who had broken at Camden. They were the men who, by the standards of the Continental Army, could not be relied on to stand against a determined bayonet charge. Morgan asked them for 2 volleys, just 2. He told them to wait until the British were within 40 yards, to aim carefully, to fire deliberately, and then, after 2 volleys, to retreat, not to run, to retreat in good order, around the left flank of the third line where they would reform behind the ridge. The third line, another 150 yards back, on the crest of the ridge itself, was composed of about 450 Continental regulars, Marylanders, Delawareans, a few Virginians. These were professional soldiers, hardened by years of campaigning, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard. They were the anchor. They were the wall the British would break themselves against. They would not retreat. They would stand. And behind them, hidden in a shallow depression behind the ridge, completely invisible to anyone advancing from the south, Morgan placed his cavalry. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington commanded about 80 dragoons of the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons, reinforced by about 45 mounted militia under Lieutenant Colonel James McCall. They were Morgan's reserve. They were the hammer that would fall when the moment was right. And they would not be visible until that moment came. The arrangement had a particular logic. The skirmishers would bleed the British, killing officers and disrupting command. The militia would deliver 2 heavy volleys and then perform what looked like a retreat, but was actually a planned withdrawal. The Continentals would absorb the main assault, and the cavalry, hidden until the last possible moment, would emerge to crush the disordered British when their cohesion had finally broken. But the deeper logic was psychological. Morgan was building a trap that worked by giving Tarleton exactly what Tarleton wanted to see. Tarleton's doctrine was based on the assumption that militia would break. He had seen it at Camden. He had built his reputation on running down broken militia. He expected, when he looked across the field at Cowpens, to see militia fire a ragged volley and flee. He expected to charge after them and ride them down. He expected the rest of the battle to be a pursuit, not a battle. Morgan was going to give him exactly that. He was going to show him fleeing militia. He was going to invite the British charge. And then, when the British were committed, when their formations had broken into a disorganized pursuit, when they had run themselves uphill and out of breath and out of order, Morgan was going to spring the trap. It was a defense built around the enemy's assumptions about the defender. It was a tactical trap that depended completely on Tarleton being Tarleton. The night of January 16, 1781, on Hannah's Cowpens, was cold and clear. The moon was nearly full. The temperature dropped through the evening hours toward freezing. Men huddled around campfires in clusters, eating what rations they had been issued, cleaning their muskets, sharpening bayonets, talking in low voices about what the morning would bring. Daniel Morgan moved among them. He could not walk easily. His joints, swollen from the cold and from the accumulated punishment of 3 decades of campaigning, made every step a small act of will. But he moved anyway, from fire to fire, stopping at each cluster of men to talk. He talked to the riflemen first, the skirmishers, the men who would stand the forward line and shoot at officers. He told them to aim carefully, to choose their targets, to bring down the men with the gold braid. He told them they could fall back when they had done enough damage, that their job was to bleed the British and then to get away clean. He told them, in the language of frontier riflemen, that he had seen what they could do at Saratoga, and that he trusted them to do it again. He talked to the militia next. These were the men he was most worried about. They knew it. They had been at Camden, some of them, or they knew men who had been. They knew what they had done at Camden. They had broken. They had run before the British bayonet charge reached them. They had thrown down their muskets and fled, and their flight had cost an American army its life. They were ashamed of it. They wanted more than anything to be told they could redeem themselves. Morgan gave them that. He explained the plan. He explained their part of it. 2 volleys. Just 2. Wait until the British are within 40 yards. Aim, fire, reload if you can. Fire again, then turn and retreat. Not run, retreat. Around the left flank of the 3rd line, where the Continentals would protect them, where they would reform, and where, when the time came, they would return to the fight from a position of advantage. He told them, in his own words, that he was not asking them to win the battle. He was asking them to fire 2 volleys. Any man who could load and aim a musket could fire 2 volleys. They had done it in their lives 100 times, hunting deer in the woods. 2 volleys at 40 yards, that was all. That was enough. He, Daniel Morgan, would do the rest. He told them about his back. He told them about the 500 lashes. He told them, with the grin that his men knew so well, that the King of England owed him 1 lash, and that he intended to collect it tomorrow with interest. The men laughed. They had heard the story before. Most of them had heard it from Morgan himself. But hearing it the night before a battle, from a man who could barely walk and who was about to ask them to stand in front of the most feared cavalry commander in America, hit differently. It hit the way Morgan intended it to hit. It reminded them that the man asking them to stand had stood through things they could not imagine, and that he was still standing, and that he was asking only that they do, for a few minutes the next morning, what he had done for a lifetime. He talked to the Continentals last. These were his professionals. He did not need to motivate them the way he motivated the militia. He needed to tell them simply what he expected. They were the anchor. They would receive the British attack. They would hold. Howard would command them directly. Morgan would be behind them with the reserves, ready to move where the situation demanded. There would be no retreat for the Continentals. There would only be the line they had been given, and the bayonets they carried, and the discipline that had brought them through 5 years of war. Howard, for his part, walked his own line that evening. He checked positions. He talked to his company commanders. He made sure every man knew where he was supposed to stand and what he was supposed to do. He was a Maryland gentleman, only 28 years old himself. But he had been in the Army since 1776 and had fought at most of the major battles of the war. He carried the kind of quiet authority that veteran officers develop, the kind that did not need to shout because everyone around him already knew what he expected. Andrew Pickens was a different kind of officer. He was 40 in 1781, an age at which most men of his era considered themselves elderly. He was a Presbyterian elder in the strictest sense, a man whose faith was the center of his life and whose conduct in war was governed by religious conviction. He had taken an oath of parole to the British after the fall of Charleston, agreeing not to fight again in exchange for being allowed to return home. He had kept that oath because he was a man who kept his word. Then, in late 1780, a loyalist raiding party had attacked his home. They had plundered his property. They had threatened his family. Pickens had formally renounced his parole, telling the British that since they had not protected him, he no longer considered himself bound by the agreement. Then he had taken up arms again. His militia at Cowpens was personal. These were his neighbors. These were men whose homes had been threatened, whose families had been intimidated, whose property had been damaged. They had every reason to fight, and they had a commander who understood, in his bones, what they were fighting for. The army did not have enough food. The march from the Pacolet had been hard, and the supply train had not caught up. Morgan ordered the slaughter of several head of cattle from the local herds, and the men ate fresh beef cooked over open fires. It was the kind of meal that allowed men to sleep with full bellies and to wake the next morning with strength in their arms. When Morgan finally lay down in his own tent, he did not sleep. He thought through the plan again. He walked it in his mind, from the first British contact with the skirmishers all the way through to the final cavalry charge. He looked for the places where it could go wrong. By dawn, he had not slept. But he had done the work of a commander, which is to think through in advance the things that might happen in battle, so that when they happen, the response is already prepared. This was the difference between Morgan and Tarleton on the most fundamental level. Tarleton, the night before the battle, had marched his men through the dark, pushing them forward without rest, betting that speed would compensate for fatigue and that surprise would compensate for everything else. Morgan, the night before the battle, had let his men sleep and eat and prepare, and had used the time himself to think. The British arrived at Cowpens exhausted and improvised. The Americans waited for them rested and rehearsed. The difference would show in the first 10 minutes of the engagement. Tarleton arrived at the field at first light on January 17th, 1781. He had been marching his men through the dark since 2 o'clock in the morning. His infantry was exhausted. His cavalry mounts were tired. The men had not eaten a hot meal in days. But Tarleton saw, when the dawn light grew strong enough to read the ground, exactly what he expected to see. He saw an army deployed in the open. He saw militia in the front lines, easily recognizable by their lack of uniforms, their hunting shirts, their disordered formation. He saw behind them what looked like a smaller force of Continental regulars. He saw no fortifications. He saw no commanding heights. He saw a piece of ground that, to a cavalry officer with his doctrine, looked like a gift. He did not see the swales. The dry winter morning had reduced their visible saturation. The grass on the surface looked the same as the grass on the ridge. To recognize the wet ground required either a geologist's eye or the kind of close inspection that Tarleton, in his eagerness to attack, did not perform. He deployed quickly, his infantry across the meadow, with the 7th Royal Fusiliers on the left, the British Legion infantry in the center, and the light infantry companies extending the line to the right of the Green River Road. The 1st Battalion of the 71st Highlanders, Fraser's Highlanders, was held in reserve behind the main line. His 2 3-pounder grasshopper cannons in the center, light field guns designed for mobility, the kind of artillery a fast-moving column could keep up with. 50 dragoons on each flank. The rest of the British Legion cavalry behind the infantry, ready to exploit the breakthrough that Tarleton was certain would come within minutes of the first contact. He did not bother with a formal artillery preparation. He did not bother with a careful reconnaissance. He had marched all night to catch Morgan. He had caught him. He intended to finish the matter before breakfast. He gave the order to advance. The British line moved forward at a trot, drums beating, fifes playing. The light infantry on the flanks, the line infantry in the center, the Highlanders in reserve, the cavalry waiting for their moment. It was, by every standard of British military doctrine, a textbook advance. It was professional, It was confident. It was the kind of advance that had broken American armies at Long Island, at Brandywine, at Camden. The American skirmishers waited until the British were within 150 yards. Then they began to fire. The fire was not a volley. It was deliberate. Individual riflemen, each picking his target, each squeezing his trigger when his sight settled on the chest of a British officer. The Pennsylvania and Virginia long rifle was a weapon of extraordinary accuracy in trained hands. At 150 yards, a marksman with a long rifle could hit a man-sized target with reasonable consistency. At 100 yards, he could hit a head. The Americans aimed for the epaulets, the gold-braided shoulder pieces that distinguished officers from rank and file. They aimed for the men with swords. They aimed for the men on horseback. They aimed for the men whose absence would cause the most damage to British command and control. In the opening minutes of the British advance, the skirmishers killed or wounded an estimated 15 British dragoons and a substantial portion of the British officer corps in the advancing line. Sergeants found themselves suddenly in command of platoons. Officers shouted for their men to maintain formation while watching their own colleagues fall around them. The British advance continued because it was the kind of disciplined advance that did not stop for casualties. But the command structure that ran it had been damaged within the first quarter mile of contact. The skirmishers, their work done, began to fall back. They retreated as they had been ordered in their own time, finding new positions behind trees, firing as they went, melting back through the gaps in Pickens' militia line. By the time the British infantry reached effective musket range, the skirmishers were gone, absorbed into the militia formation or filtering back further toward the third line. The British came on. They were trained soldiers. They had absorbed casualties before. They closed the range. At 40 yards, Pickens' militia opened fire. A musket volley at 40 yards, delivered by men who had been ordered to aim and who were trained to aim, was a devastating weapon. The smoothbore musket of the 18th century was not accurate at longer ranges. It was a weapon designed for close combat, for the moment when armies came within killing distance of each other, and the side that fired first and fired straight would win. At 40 yards, even militia could be deadly. Pickens's men were not the militia who had broken at Camden. Or rather, some of them were. But they had been told, by a man they trusted, that 2 volleys was all that would be asked of them. They had been told where to stand. They had been told what to do afterward. They had been given a plan that respected their limits as soldiers, and that gave them, at the same time, a clear and survivable role in the battle. They held their fire. They waited. They aimed. The first volley went into the British line and dropped men by the dozens. The second volley, fired moments later, dropped more. Together, the 2 volleys killed or wounded somewhere around 2/3 of the remaining British officers in the leading regiments, on top of the damage the skirmishers had already done. The British advance staggered. Whole companies found themselves leaderless. Sergeants and corporals tried to maintain forward momentum, but the formation was no longer the disciplined wall of bayonets that had crossed the field minutes earlier. And then, exactly as Morgan had planned, the militia turned and ran. They did not run in a route. They ran in good order in the direction they had been told to run, around the left flank of the third line, heading for the rear where they would reform under the protection of the Continentals. To anyone watching, this would have looked like a militia route. To anyone who had been at Camden, this would have looked like the moment when the American army began to come apart. Tarleton saw it. He saw exactly what he expected to see, and he ordered his army to charge. The British line broke into a run. Their formations dissolved into a forward rush, men sprinting up the slope of the ridge, certain that victory was 100 yards away, certain that the Continentals on the crest would break the moment the British bayonets reached them. They yelled, they cheered, they ran. They ran straight up the ridge, met into the 3rd American line. John Eager Howard's Continentals waited. They were not the men who had broken at Camden. They were the survivors of Long Island, of Brandywine, of Germantown, of Monmouth. They were the long-service corps of the American Army, men who had spent half a decade learning their trade in the hardest school there was. They held their fire until the British, breathless and disorganized, reached close range. And then they delivered a volley that should have shattered the British attack. It did not. There were too many British. They had absorbed the volley and kept coming. The Highlanders, Frasers, the 71st Highlanders, were committed by Tarleton at this point, ordered to swing wide around the American right and complete the envelopment. Major Archibald MacArthur led them forward. They were a hardened Scottish regiment. Many of them spoke only Gaelic and depended on their officers for direction. They had traded their kilts for long trousers, a concession to the insect-infested South. They were the kind of soldiers who, in conventional terms, could not be expected to break. But to execute their flanking order, they had to leave the dry ridge and descend into the swale on the American right. The wet weather springs were active. The ground that looked like firm grass at a distance was, beneath the surface, saturated mud. The Highlanders, weighted down by 50-pound knapsacks, by heavy red wool coats, by muskets and bayonets and the standard issue of cartridges and equipment, struggled through the bog. Their boots sank with every step. Their formation lost its alignment. Men who should have been moving forward at the same pace as their neighbors found themselves stuck while the man next to them pulled free. The whole maneuver, which was supposed to be a swift, flanking movement timed to coincide with the main British infantry assault on the American center, slowed to a crawl. By the time the Highlanders emerged from the swale, they were late. They were exhausted. They were out of alignment. And the moment Tarleton had planned, the moment when the entire British force would strike the Continentals from front and flank simultaneously, had passed. The Highlanders pressed forward into the American right, but they did so as an isolated regiment, attacking late against an enemy that now had time to respond. John Eager Howard saw the Highlanders coming. He ordered his rightmost company to face about and wheel to meet the threat. A complicated parade ground maneuver that required precise communication in the middle of a battle where the noise was overwhelming. The order was misheard. The men closest to Howard understood it correctly. The men further down the line heard only the first part of the command and assumed they were being ordered to retreat. The entire Continental line began to fall back. Daniel Morgan was at the rear when the 3rd line began to retreat. For a moment, watching from his position behind the ridge, he thought everything had collapsed. He thought his Continentals, the anchor of his entire defense, had broken. He thought the battle was lost. Then he looked more carefully. The Continentals were not running. They were retreating in perfect order, maintaining their formation, walking back down the reverse slope of the ridge as if they were on a parade ground. There was no panic. There was no break. There was simply a misunderstood order being executed with the discipline of veteran troops who, when in doubt, did what they were told and waited for someone to clarify. Morgan made an instant decision. Instead of trying to halt the retreat, he chose a new defensive position further back and rode forward to give new orders. The Continentals would halt at the new position. They would face about. They would deliver a volley at close range, and then they would charge. Meanwhile, the British, watching the Continental line withdraw, made the assumption Morgan was praying they would make. They assumed the retreat was a rout. They assumed the battle was over. They broke their own formations and ran forward in a disorganized mob, weapons in the air, voices raised in the kind of triumphant shout that armies make when they think they are about to win. They were no longer a coordinated military formation. They were a crowd of men chasing what they believed was a beaten enemy up a slope toward what they believed was certain victory. Morgan rode along his line. He waited until the Continentals had reached the position he had chosen. He waited until the British were close enough that the next thing he did would not be a volley, but a slaughter. And then he gave the order that has become, in American military history, one of the most quoted commands ever issued in battle. Face about, boys. Give them one good volley, and the victory is ours. The Continentals wheeled. 450 muskets came up in a single coordinated movement. The British, who were within 20 yards now, suddenly found themselves looking down the barrels of an enemy they had been chasing, and that was no longer running. There was a single moment of recognition, a moment of horror. And then the Continentals fired. The volley at that range was annihilating. The leading British ranks went down in a single thunderclap of musketry. Men who had been running fell where they stood. The shouts of triumph turned, in the same second, into shouts of pain and terror. And before the British survivors could process what had happened, John Eager Howard ordered the bayonet charge. The Continentals lunged forward. They drove their bayonets into the staggered, broken British line. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was brutal and brief. The British, who moments earlier had been certain of victory, found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy they had thought beaten. Some of them tried to stand. Most of them broke. And at that exact moment, the cavalry hidden in the depression behind the ridge came out. William Washington, on his horse, leading the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons and the mounted militia under James McCall, came up over the ridge at a gallop. They crashed into the British right flank, just as the Continentals were driving forward in the center. From the other direction, Andrew Pickens's militia, which had reformed in the rear after their planned withdrawal, came around the hill to strike the British left. The British found themselves attacked from 3 sides simultaneously: front, right flank, left flank. The only direction they could retreat was back down the slope, toward the field they had crossed in confidence 40 minutes earlier. And that direction was now blocked by their own broken units, by the wreckage of their advance, by the rest of their army trying to figure out what was happening. It was a double envelopment. Of all the things that almost never happen in 18th century warfare, a double envelopment was perhaps the rarest. It required perfect coordination of multiple separate forces, perfect timing, an enemy who cooperated by attacking exactly where you wanted him to attack. It almost never came together in a real battle. It came together at Cowpens. The British line collapsed, not slowly, not in stages, all at once. Hundreds of soldiers, surrounded and seeing no escape, threw down their muskets and raised their hands. Whole companies surrendered en masse. The 7th Royal Fusiliers, one of the most distinguished regiments in the British Army, gave up its colors. The Highlanders, still trying to extract themselves from the swale, found themselves cut off from the rest of the army with no path of retreat. Tarleton, watching from the rear with the cavalry he had not yet committed, tried to organize a counterattack. He ordered his Legion Dragoons forward. They refused. They had seen the disaster. They had seen the front of their army disappear into a cloud of musket smoke and emerge as prisoners. They were not going to ride into the same trap. Tarleton screamed at them. They sat their horses and did not move. He led the few who would follow him forward in a desperate rearguard action, trying to cover the withdrawal of what was left of his army and to save the 2 3-pounder grasshopper cannons that were the pride of his command. The cannons were lost, The American cavalry was on top of them within minutes. The crews were killed or captured. The guns themselves were dragged off as trophies. Two of the most prized artillery pieces in the British Southern Army, now in the hands of an American Brigadier General, who, an hour earlier, had been a fugitive trying to find a place to make a stand. And then, in the middle of the collapse, on the Green River Road, two men found themselves alone together. William Washington was a second cousin of George Washington. He was a cavalry officer in the Continental Army. He had been chasing the retreating British and Loyalist horsemen down the road, far in advance of his own troopers, doing what he always did, which was to lead from the front. He was a brave man. He was, on that particular morning, perhaps too brave for his own good. He had outrun his own command. He was alone on a road full of fleeing enemies, and he was about to discover what that meant. Banastre Tarleton, riding the other direction with two of his officers, saw Washington. He recognized him. He knew who Washington was. He had been chasing the American cavalry for months, and now finally, the commander of that cavalry was alone in front of him. Tarleton and his two officers wheeled and charged. The fullest contemporary account of what happened next came from John Eager Howard, who witnessed the engagement and recounted it years later to historian William Johnson in 1822. According to Howard, the three British officers advanced abreast. One of them, identified in some accounts as Cornet Thomas Patterson of the 17th Light Dragoons, struck the first blow at Washington. Washington rose in his stirrups to parry the blow with his own sword, the standard cavalry parry, the move that any trained dragoon would make. The British officer's blade came down on Washington's saber with the full weight of a charging horseman behind it. Washington's sword broke at the hilt. The blade snapped off and fell into the dirt of the road. He was, in that instant, a man holding a useless metal handle in the middle of a road full of enemies, with a British officer lifting his saber for a second strike that would have ended his life. A young American came up behind him. Contemporary accounts describe him variously as Washington's bugler, his trumpeter, his orderly, or his waiter. He was, by most accounts, young. One source places him at 14 years old. Later historical research, drawing on pension records and regimental rolls, has tentatively identified him as a black soldier named William Collin or Collins, though this identification is not certain. None of the contemporary descriptions explicitly note him as black. The identification rests on later accounts and on the famous 1845 William Ranney painting that depicted him as African American, a depiction that may reflect Ranney's assumption that waiters in this period were typically black men. What is not in dispute is what he did. He leveled his pistol. He fired. The ball hit the British officer just as the saber was beginning its downward stroke, and the officer's arm fell limp. The saber dropped. Washington was alive. A second British officer attempted a saber thrust at Washington in the same instant. This time it was Sergeant Major Perry of Washington's own command, arriving at speed, who parried the blow and disabled the second attacker. Tarleton himself arrived an instant later. He took his own swing at Washington. Washington parried with the broken hilt of his sword, the only weapon he had, and somehow turned the blow aside. Other American dragoons were arriving now. Tarleton, seeing that he was about to be surrounded, reined up. He turned his horse. He fled. As he rode away, he turned in the saddle and fired his pistol back over his shoulder at Washington. The ball missed Washington, but creased his knee and struck Washington's horse. The animal staggered, but did not fall. Tarleton disappeared into the woods at the edge of the road, riding for his life, accompanied by the 54 dragoons of his legion, who had managed to follow him out of the wreckage. It was the last act of the battle. By the time the smoke cleared, the British Legion as a fighting unit no longer existed. The 7th Royal Fusiliers had surrendered. Fraser's Highlanders had surrendered. The 17th Light Dragoons, the elite British cavalry regiment attached to the Legion, was destroyed. The 2 grasshopper cannons were in American hands. And Banastre Tarleton was riding north through the woods with 54 men, all that remained of a force that had set out from Cornwallis's camp a week earlier, numbering more than 1,000. The numbers, when they were finally counted, told a story that was almost impossible to believe. The British had brought approximately 1,100 men to the field. Some sources put the figure as high as 1,200. They were not just any 1,000 men. Much of the force was the cutting edge of Cornwallis's Southern Army. The 1st Battalion of the 71st Highlanders, the 17th Light Dragoons, the British Legion Infantry and Cavalry, the 2 grasshopper cannons with their professional artillery crews, the detachment of the 7th Royal Fusiliers, contested by historians but containing both veteran troops and recent recruits. This was the force Cornwallis depended on for mobile operations, for shock attacks, for the kind of fast-moving warfare that the Southern campaign required. Of those 1,100 or 1,200 men, approximately 110 were killed, including roughly 40 officers. 229 were wounded. Between 529 and over 700 were captured, depending on which source one consults, including 27 officers. The total casualty rate ran above 75% and may have approached 80%. The British Legion, as a fighting formation, ceased to exist. The 71st Highlanders ceased to exist. The 7th Royal Fusiliers, a regiment that had been part of the British Army since the late 17th century, was effectively destroyed and lost its colors. The Americans, in contrast, lost 24 to 25 men killed, and between 104 and 124 wounded. The official casualty figures may understate the true total. Modern analysis of pension records and burial records suggests the actual American losses may have been closer to 128 total. Either way, the casualty ratio was lopsided beyond anything that conventional military doctrine would have predicted. A force outnumbered on paper, composed largely of militia who had broken in previous battles, commanded by a general so crippled by joint pain that he could barely walk, had destroyed the elite of the British Southern Army in less than an hour. The killed-to-killed ratio was 4-1 in the Americans' favor. The overall loss ratio was approaching 8-1. Tarleton had brought a force capable of defeating any conventional American army in the field, and had returned to Cornwallis with 54 dragoons and the news that everything he had been entrusted with was gone. He rode hard for Cornwallis's camp. He arrived on January 18th or January 19th, the exact date varying by source, carrying with him the worst news any officer could bring to a commanding general. According to an account preserved by an American prisoner of war who was present in Cornwallis's camp, the British general was standing with his sword in his hand when Tarleton delivered the report. He pressed his sword against the ground. He leaned on it. He kept leaning, the story goes, until the steel snapped. The account is hearsay, repeated by a single witness years after the event, and historians treat the specific image with appropriate caution. What is not in dispute is the broader fact behind it. Cornwallis had just learned that the strategic foundation of his southern campaign no longer existed. Major Archibald MacArthur, the captured commander of the 71st Highlanders, was less restrained in expressing his views. He told his American captors that the best troops in the British service had been sacrificed under the command of a boy. The phrase was deliberate. It was an indictment of Tarleton specifically, and of the broader culture of the British officer corps that had allowed a 26-year-old of purchased commission to command and lose the elite of the Southern Army. MacArthur was a professional soldier. He had spent his life in the Army. He understood what had been lost, and he was willing to say so to the men holding him prisoner. The strategic implications of Cowpens reached far beyond the loss of 1,000 men. Tarleton's legion was the eyes and ears of Cornwallis's army. It was the mobile force that could chase down Patriot partisans, escort supply convoys, screen the main army's movements. Without it, Cornwallis was effectively blind. He could not respond to partisan raids. He could not protect his supply lines. He could not move his army through hostile country without exposing it to threats he could not see coming. The fast-moving war that the Southern campaign required had just had its primary instrument destroyed. Cornwallis made a decision. He would chase Morgan. He would catch him. He would recapture the prisoners and avenge the destruction of the Legion. He needed to do this not just for military reasons, but for political reasons. The news of Cowpens would shake every loyalist in the South. It would embolden every Patriot partisan. It would make the difference between a Southern campaign that was winning, slowly, and a Southern campaign that was collapsing. But to chase Morgan, Cornwallis needed speed. And to gain speed, he made the decision that would, in retrospect, mark the beginning of the end of the British war effort in the South. He burned his own supply train. He ordered his heavy baggage burned. His traveling forges, the mobile blacksmith shops that allowed his army to make repairs in the field, were burned. His extra wagons, his tents. The accumulated material support of a campaigning army was set on fire on the morning of January 25th, 1781. And Cornwallis's army began to move north at the pace of light infantry, carrying only what each man could carry on his back. The race that followed has its own name in American military history. The race to the Dan. The race to the Dan was a pursuit across the rivers of North Carolina. Greene and Morgan, having reunited their forces, retreated north toward Virginia, where they could reach the Dan River and cross to safety. Cornwallis, with his stripped-down light army, chased them. The pursuit lasted weeks. It covered hundreds of miles. It crossed the Catawba River, the Yadkin River, and finally the Dan itself. Twice, Cornwallis nearly caught the Americans. Twice, the weather intervened. Both times, the Americans crossed a river just before a sudden winter storm raised the waters and rendered the fords impassable. Cornwallis would arrive at the Catawba, find Greene gone, the river too high to cross. He would push his men through the rising waters at extreme risk and eventually get across, only to find Greene already approaching the next river. He would arrive at the Yadkin. The same thing happened. He would push on. He would arrive at the Dan and find that Greene had crossed in boats that the Americans had positioned in advance and then taken with them to the far bank, leaving Cornwallis on the southern side of an unfordable river with no way across. The British general, exhausted, his army stripped of supplies, far from his coastal bases, with no way to pursue further, turned his army around. He marched back south. The race to the Dan was over. Greene had escaped, and Cornwallis, in the process of failing to catch him, had marched his army to a place from which it could not easily return to its bases in the Carolinas. What followed was the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781. Greene, now reinforced, turned and faced Cornwallis. He used a defense in depth modeled on Morgan's tactics at Cowpens, 3 successive lines, militia in front, Continentals in the rear. The battle was hard fought. Cornwallis technically won. He held the field at the end of the day. But the cost of his victory was the destruction of a quarter of his army, roughly 500 British casualties out of an army that had begun the day at less than 2,000 effective troops. The British politician Charles James Fox, speaking to the House of Commons when the report of Guilford Courthouse reached London, made the comment that has come down to history. Another such victory he said, would ruin the British Army. Cornwallis, after Guilford Courthouse, did not have the strength to maintain a campaign in the Carolinas. He marched his army to Wilmington on the North Carolina coast, where the Royal Navy could resupply him. From Wilmington, instead of returning to South Carolina to resume the pacification of the backcountry he had been trying to conquer, he made a fateful decision. He marched north into Virginia. His reasoning, as he explained it in his correspondence with Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief in New York, was that Virginia was the source of the rebellion in the South. That if Virginia could be neutralized, the Carolinas would fall on their own. He moved his army to a small tobacco port on the York River called Yorktown. He established a base there. He waited for the Royal Navy to bring him supplies and reinforcements. The Royal Navy did not come. The French fleet, in a moment of perfect timing, arrived in Chesapeake Bay and defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Capes on September 5, 1781. Cornwallis was cut off from the sea. George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau, moving with extraordinary speed from New York, arrived at Yorktown with a combined Franco-American army. They besieged Cornwallis. The siege lasted 3 weeks. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The British army that surrendered at Yorktown was the same army that had marched north from Wilmington 6 months earlier. It was the army that had won Pyrrhically at Guilford Courthouse, the army that had been stripped down and chased across North Carolina, the army that had failed to catch Greene at the Dan, the army that had been forced to abandon the Carolinas because it no longer had the strength to hold them. And the reason it no longer had that strength, the reason its mobile component had been destroyed, the reason its commander had been forced into the desperate strategic gamble that ended with the loss of his entire force, was Cowpens. There is a chain of causation that runs from a frozen pasture in South Carolina to a surrender ceremony on a Virginia field 9 months later. And the chain runs through Cowpens. Every link in it can be traced. Take away Cowpens, and the British Legion still exists. Take away the Legion's destruction, and Cornwallis can pursue Greene more effectively. Take away the loss of the Legion, and Cornwallis does not need to burn his supply train. Take away the burned supply train, and Cornwallis does not lose his ability to sustain a campaign in the Carolinas. Take away the failure of the Southern campaign, and Cornwallis does not march into Virginia. Take away the move into Virginia, and there is no Yorktown. This is not the kind of clean counterfactual that historians can prove. History does not work that way. There are too many variables. The French fleet might still have come. Washington might have found another opportunity. The British war effort, exhausted by 6 years of conflict and the entry of multiple European powers against it, might have collapsed regardless. But within the actual sequence of events, within the chain of decisions that did happen, Cowpens is the moment when the foundation began to give way. It was less than an hour of fighting, a few hundred dead, an open pasture in the South Carolina backcountry, and it set in motion the events that ended the British Empire's first attempt to hold North America by force. Daniel Morgan, when the battle was over, sat down on a log near the field and began to laugh. His joints hurt. He could barely stand. He had been awake for most of 2 days, but he had won. He had taken an army that should have been destroyed and used it to destroy the army that was trying to destroy it. He had vindicated, in a single morning, every theory of warfare he had ever held, every conviction about militia and ground, and the psychology of soldiers that had built up in him over 3 decades of fighting. He wrote to Nathaniel Greene that evening. The report was concise. He gave the figures. He gave the names of the units engaged. He described briefly the disposition of his lines, and the moment of the double envelopment. He did not boast. He simply reported. And then, at the end of the letter, he requested permission to retire from active service. His health, he said, would not allow him to continue. Greene granted the request. Morgan rode home to Virginia in February of 1781. He never fought again. He lived out the rest of his life on his farm, suffering increasingly from the joint pain and the consequences of decades of hard service. He died in 1802 at the age of 66. His last public service was a brief tour as a Federalist congressman from Virginia in the 1790s. The man who designed the most innovative tactical victory of the American Revolution, who broke the British Legion, who set in motion the chain of events that ended at Yorktown, retired after his greatest victory and never returned to the field. There is something appropriate in that. The old wagoner had done what he came to do. He went home. Banastre Tarleton lived a very different aftermath. He survived the war. He returned to England in 1782. He became, in the way of failed British officers, a politician. He stood for Parliament from Liverpool, his hometown, and served as a member of the House of Commons for many years. He defended the slave trade. He opposed abolition. He published a self-justifying memoir in 1787 in which he blamed the loss at Cowpens on his subordinates and on bad luck. He became, in his own country, a controversial figure, admired by some for his service and reviled by others for his record of cruelty in America. He never apologized for Waxhaws. He never accepted responsibility for Cowpens. He died in 1833 at the age of 78, having outlived nearly everyone who could contradict his version of events. His name remained, in the United States, a synonym for British military cruelty. In Britain, it remained a synonym for a particular kind of failed dash. The brilliant young officer, whose career peaked early and never recovered from a single catastrophic miscalculation. William Washington went on to a distinguished career in the Continental Cavalry. He fought at Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781 and at Hobkirk's Hill in April. His war ended on September 8, 1781, at the Battle of Eutaw Springs, where his horse was shot from under him during a charge into a dense thicket. Pinned beneath the dying animal, he was bayoneted and taken prisoner. He spent the remainder of the war under house arrest in British-held Charleston. After the war, he married into a wealthy planter family, served in the South Carolina legislature, and lived out his life as a Southern gentleman. He died on March 6, 1810. The story of the duel on the Green River Road became one of the founding legends of American cavalry tradition. The young American who saved Washington's life, possibly named Colin or Collins, vanishes from the historical record. If he was African American, as later accounts and the 1845 Ranney painting suggest, he may have served out the war as a free man, or he may have died of disease in a Continental camp, or he may have returned to slavery. Many black soldiers who served in the Revolution were either freedmen who fought for promised wages or enslaved men whose enlistments did not necessarily end their bondage. We do not know what happened to him. We do not know with certainty his name. We do not know with certainty even his race. He fired one of the most important pistol shots of the Southern campaign, and the historical record swallowed him whole. There is something that has to be said about this, regardless of which specific man he was. The American Revolution was fought, on the American side, by an army that included thousands of black men. Some were free, some were enslaved, some served as substitutes for white owners who paid them to take their places in the militia. Some served for promises of freedom that were sometimes kept and sometimes not. They fought at Saratoga. They fought at Monmouth. They fought at Cowpens. They fought at Yorktown. And the historical record, written by white officers for white audiences, recorded their names only intermittently, only when it was unavoidable, only when something they did was too important to ignore. The man who saved William Washington was one of those soldiers. He saved Washington's life with a pistol shot fired from horseback in the middle of a chaotic cavalry melee. And his reward, from history, was a footnote in someone else's biography. The footnote is all we have. It is not nothing. But it is far less than what he earned. The Battle of Cowpens entered American military memory immediately. It was, for a country that was used to losing battles, a victory that needed no exaggeration. The casualty figures spoke for themselves. The strategic consequences spoke for themselves. The name Tarleton, which had been spoken with fear across the southern colonies for a year, was now spoken with contempt. But the deeper military lessons of Cowpens took longer to enter formal doctrine. Morgan's defense in depth was studied. The use of militia for limited, achievable tasks was noted. The cavalry reserve hidden behind the ridge became a standard example in cavalry textbooks of how to use mobile forces in coordination with infantry. The double envelopment itself was analyzed and discussed, though it remained, as it had been before Cowpens, the rarest of tactical outcomes. What was less often discussed, what almost never appeared in the formal military histories of the battle, was the geology, the wet weather swales, the dry ridge of quartz muscovite schist, the impermeable biotite gneiss beneath the flanking depressions, the ancient thrust sheets, hundreds of millions of years old, that had given Morgan the precise terrain he needed. This was the unspoken element of the victory, the element that made everything else possible. Morgan did not just design a brilliant defense. He found ground that would force the British to fight that defense on his terms. The trap depended on the swales. The swales depended on the geology. The geology had been laid down in the Proterozoic eon and exposed by hundreds of millions of years of erosion, and was waiting in January of 1781 for a man who could see what it was offering. Other battles in the Southern campaign demonstrated the same principle. Francis Marion's swamp campaigns were exercises in geological warfare. The Battle of Black Mingo, where Marion drove loyalists into the deep waters of the swamp, where their bodies were found floating days later. The Battle of Tiercote Swamp, where Marion's three-pronged night attack shattered a loyalist force that had bivouacked with a swamp at its rear, thinking the water would protect them. The Ox Swamp Pursuit, where Tarleton had been humiliated 3 months before Cowpens, his horses collapsing in the bogs. His frustration eventually producing the brutal retaliatory raids that did more to harm the British cause than any partisan victory could have. The Battle of Raft Swamp in October of 1781, fought after Cowpens, after the race to the Dan, even after Yorktown, demonstrated the same lesson on a smaller scale. Patriot cavalry under Major Joseph Graham caught a loyalist force on the narrow causeways across a North Carolina swamp. The loyalists could not maneuver. They could not retreat except down the causeways themselves, where they were vulnerable to charge. Graham broke their formation and drove the survivors into the surrounding wetlands as night fell. The same geometry, the same principle, the same lesson. The southern landscape, taken together, was a teaching tool. It taught American commanders that the conventional military doctrines they had learned from European manuals did not necessarily apply in the swamps and forests and ridges of the Carolinas. It taught them that ground, properly understood, could be a force multiplier of enormous power. It taught them, in the end, that an army that understood its terrain could defeat an army that did not. This was the lesson of Cowpens. It was the lesson of the Southern campaign as a whole. And it was a lesson that would be taught and retaught in different terrain and different wars for the next 2.5 centuries. Modern military academies still teach cowpens. They teach it for several reasons. They teach it because the defense in depth Morgan designed is a model of how to use forces of unequal quality in a single coordinated operation. Most armies, throughout history, have had to fight with mixed forces. Some units of high quality, some of low quality. The challenge is always how to use the low-quality units in ways that contribute to victory without exposing them to tasks they cannot perform. Morgan's 3-line system is one of the cleanest historical examples of how to do this. Each unit did what it was best at, and the combination produced a victory that no single one of them could have produced alone. They teach it because the use of terrain at Cowpens is a textbook case of force multiplication through environment. The dry ridge and the wet swales were not, in themselves, dramatic geological features. They would not have impressed a casual observer. But in the hands of a commander who understood what they were, they neutralized the numerical and qualitative advantages of an enemy that should have won the engagement. This is the lesson modern armies absorb when they study the battle. Know your ground. Walk it before the battle. Read it the way a sailor reads water. They teach it because the psychological design of the trap, the deliberate construction of a battlefield that gave the enemy exactly what the enemy expected to see, is a model of operational deception. Tarleton was not stupid. He was not incompetent. But he was predictable. His doctrine was known. His expectations were known. Morgan built a trap that depended on those expectations, that worked because Tarleton would do what Tarleton always did. The deeper lesson is that competence and predictability, taken together, are vulnerabilities. An enemy who knows your doctrine can build a battlefield to exploit it. They teach it because the strategic consequences of a tactical victory at Cowpens demonstrate the disproportionate impact of certain battles. Most battles, throughout history, are not decisive. They do not change the strategic situation. Cowpens was different. It was, by any reasonable measurement, the inflection point of the Southern campaign. Before Cowpens, the British were winning the South. After Cowpens, they were losing it. The line between those two states ran through a single morning of combat on a single piece of ground. And they teach it because of the human dimension, because of Daniel Morgan, who could barely walk and who designed one of the most innovative tactical operations of the 18th century. Because of Andrew Pickens, the Presbyterian elder who broke his parole and led his militia to deliver 2 perfect volleys. Because of John Eager Howard, who turned a misunderstood order into a winning maneuver. Because of William Washington, who outran his own command and almost died for it. Because of Banastre Tarleton, who believed his own reputation and rode his army into a trap. And because of a young black dragoon, possibly named Collins, who fired a pistol shot at exactly the right second and changed the course of a war. War is not just systems and tactics and terrain. It is also human beings making decisions under pressure, succeeding or failing in ways that ripple outward through history in patterns no one can predict at the moment of decision. Cowpens, more than most battles, illustrates this. It was a victory of system and terrain. It was also a victory of individual choice, individual courage, individual moments that could have gone the other way and did not. The battlefield today is a national park. It sits in northwestern South Carolina, in Cherokee County, near the town of Chesnee. The Green River Road still runs through it, though it is no longer the main route from anywhere to anywhere. The ridge is still there. The swales are still there. In wet winters, after heavy seasonal rains, the wet weather springs still activate, and the low ground on either side of the road still turns into the saturated marshes that doomed Fraser's Highlanders 2.5 centuries ago. Visitors can walk the field. There are interpretive signs. There is a small visitor center with exhibits. The geology of the battlefield is described in brief in some of the interpretive materials, though it is rarely the main focus. Most visitors come to see the place where the battle happened, to stand where Morgan stood, to imagine the 3 lines of American troops on the dry ridge and the British advance up the Green River Road into the trap. The battle lasted under an hour. The consequences lasted a country. A man named Hannah, who once grazed cattle on that pasture, gave his name to a piece of ground that would become one of the decisive locations of American history. He probably did not know what he was naming. He probably never imagined what would happen on the field he had cleared for his herd. He was an ordinary backcountry settler. He named his cow pasture after himself, the way people do, and the name stuck. Hannah's Cowpens. The Cowpens. Cowpens. Daniel Morgan looked at the pasture on a winter afternoon in 1781 and saw what it could be. He chose to fight there. He arranged his men to use what the ground offered him. He used his understanding of his own soldiers, of his enemy's predictability, of the way water behaves on impermeable rock, to design a victory that should not have been possible against the force he was facing. He won. It is one of the things that has always been true of war. The side that understands its ground, that understands its enemy, that understands its own soldiers, has advantages that no quantity of equipment and no quality of professional training can fully overcome. Numbers matter. Equipment matters. Training matters. But ground matters more. Always. In every war that has ever been fought, the side that reads the terrain better has an advantage that the other side cannot easily compensate for. Tarleton did not read the terrain. He saw an open pasture, and he saw militia, and he saw what he wanted to see. He saw a chance for the kind of fast victory he had built his reputation on. He did not see the dry ridge. He did not see the wet swales. He did not see the depression behind the hill where the American cavalry waited. He saw a battlefield. Morgan had seen a trap. The trap closed in less than an hour. The British Legion ceased to exist. Cornwallis lost the South. The Royal Navy failed to relieve Yorktown. The British surrendered. And the chain of events that led to all of those things began on a winter morning in January, when a young commander who could barely walk used the ground beneath his feet as a weapon against an enemy who never bothered to look. There is a phrase from the period that has come down to us in various forms. Some attribute it to Morgan, some to Greene, some to the anonymous voice of military tradition that always seems to produce these phrases without identifiable origin. It goes like this. The British thought they had won the war when they took Charleston. They had not. They thought they had won the war when they won at Camden. They had not. They learned slowly that the war could not be won by winning battles. It could only be won by destroying an enemy who refused to be destroyed. And the enemy refused. At Cowpens, the enemy did more than refuse to be destroyed. The enemy did the destroying. The most feared cavalry formation in North America rode into a pasture in South Carolina and never rode out. The young officer who had built his reputation on running down militia learned that militia, properly led and properly placed, could destroy his army in 40 minutes. The general who had been promised an easy pacification of the Carolinas learned that the Carolinas would not be pacified. The British Empire, which had spent 6 years trying to hold its American colonies by force, took a wound at Cowpens from which it would not recover. 2.5 centuries later, the field is quiet. The interpretive signs explain what happened. The road is open to visitors. The swales, in dry weather, look like normal grass. The ridge looks like any other ridge. The whole place looks, to a casual visitor, like nothing in particular. A field, a road, some trees, the wreckage of a battle long ago. But underneath the surface, in the impermeable layers of biotite gneiss, the water is still moving. The wet weather springs are still there. In a wet winter, if you walked the swales in January, you would still find your boots sinking, your feet finding the saturated ground, the mud pulling at your ankles in exactly the way it pulled at Fraser's Highlanders when they tried to execute their flanking maneuver and discovered, too late, that the ground was not on their side. The geology has not changed. The lesson has not changed. Ground, properly read, is a weapon. Ground, properly used, can defeat any enemy. And ground, properly trusted by a commander who understands what it can do, will win battles that should not be winnable. Daniel Morgan understood this. Banastre Tarleton did not. Between the two of them, in a single morning on a piece of pasture 6 miles south of the flooded Broad River, the future of an empire was decided. It ended 9 months later at Yorktown. It began at Cowpens. It began with a pasture, a ridge, 2 swales full of water, and a man who knew how to read what the earth was telling him. Sometimes the impossible is just geology, waiting for someone clever enough to use it. Sometimes the swamps come for you twice. Sometimes the second time they hide under the grass. And sometimes, when a young American dragoon arrives at exactly the right second with a loaded pistol, the second cousin of George Washington lives to fight another day, the British cavalry commander rides for his life into the woods. And the chain of events that ends an empire begins with 3 seconds of perfect timing on a country road in South Carolina. That is how it happened. That is what Cowpens was. That is why, 2.5 centuries later, the field is still there, and the lesson is still there. And the ground itself still remembers what the army that did not read it learned, too late, on a winter morning when mathematics did not matter and geometry did, and a wagoner who could barely walk gave one of the great commands in American military history. Face about, boys. Give them one good volley, and the victory is ours. The volley came. The victory came. And the empire that thought it had won the war learned in less than an hour that it had not. The ground at Cowpens remembers. The ground always remembers. It is waiting in every battlefield, in every war, in every conflict yet to come, for the next commander wise enough to listen. Morgan listened. Tarleton did not. That, in the end, is the whole story.